Hey guys, John here, and welcome to the final video of the VPS Avenger 2 Master Course. Today's video is all about modulation and the modulation matrix. We're also going to cover the LFOs, the step sequencer, pitch section, and the mod envelope section. Avenger's modulation system is intuitive and easy to use, and I think by the end of this video, you're going to feel comfortable modulating parameters and working inside the modulation matrix. So, let's get started. The very first thing we should know and understand is what exactly is modulation. Modulation is the process of changing parameters over time in a certain way that we want. So what if we wanted distortion to start increasing as we hold down notes? Or what if we want the filter cutoff to start moving rhythmically to our track? The more comfortable you become in modulating parameters, the more complex and interesting modulations you're going to make. The basic thing to understand is that we will have a modulation source, a destination parameter, and how much of that modulation source will affect that destination parameter. A very common modulation is using an LFO to move the filter's cutoff. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's a constantly cycling waveform and is commonly under the threshold of hearing, which is about 20 Hz. However, the LFOs in Avenger can go up to 100 Hz. So let's bring our cutoff down a bit and map the first LFO to the cutoff and give it some depth by clicking and dragging on the red triangle that's going to appear next to the knob. So we bring down our cutoff something kind of like this here, maybe in the middle, and let's grab our LFO and drag and drop here and increase this depth, and let's play a note. So from an init patch, we can also make this exact same mapping without the drag and drop method, but only using the modulation matrix. So down here on the bottom right, let's click the mod matrix, and let's first click this plus right here, and remember, we were using an LFO. So if we go down to our LFO, we can select the first one here, and now we want to assign a destination to it, which is going to be our cutoff. So first, let's bring this down a little bit like we did earlier, and then we can right-click this where it says select target, and then we know it's going to be on the first filter, and then we can go to filter one cutoff, and then we can give it a little bit of depth down here, and then play a note. Now let's say we wanted to add the same LFO onto the resonance. So we can do that a couple different ways. We can either go to the LFO like we did in the beginning, we can map it like this. We can go to the mod matrix and grab this one right up here, which is the same thing, drag and drop on the resonance, or we can go to this plus here, and then we can go down to filter one, and then we can find filter one resonance, and then give it a little bit of depth right here. And now take a listen. If we now look inside the mod matrix, we can see that both parameters we mapped are grouped under LFO1. And if we look over here on the top left, we see a number 2, which indicates how many destinations this modulation source has. So the grouping is very nice because the mod matrix allows us to bypass individual destinations, or we can bypass everything that the LFO is modulating. So for example, we can bypass the resonance. We can bring that back, or we can bypass the filter one cutoff. And then up here on the top left, we can bypass the entire modulation source. One thing I really like in Avenger is that we can easily switch out the modulation source with another one, and we keep all the destinations and the depths intact. So how do we go about doing this? So down here on LFO1, we can right-click this here, and for example, if we want to put this on a macro, we can go down to our macro category, and then we select the first macro. So now this macro is going to affect these two destinations. This small arrow up here at the top is a way that we can collapse this group if we no longer need to see it. Now, this is useful if we have a lot of different things modulated and only need to open it up to make adjustments. If we have more than one modulation source mapped to different parameters, we can also collapse all the lists with the up arrow on the left-hand side of the mod matrix. So for example, if we added another LFO, and then we modulated the drive knob over here and give this a little bit of depth, if we go back to our mod matrix, down over here on the left-hand side, we can click this and it's going to collapse all the different modulation sources. In the mod matrix, for each destination, we have additional parameters. So we can change the mode from additive or to percentage mode. Now, these two modes may not seem very obvious at first, but they're extremely helpful once we understand the difference. So from an init patch, what we can do is bring our unison all the way up to the top and then our panning down all the way to the bottom. And let's grab our first macro, drag and drop to the panning and give this 100% depth. And here where it says this percentage sign, let's go ahead and click that so it's on additive first, as we're going to take a look at that first. So let's play a note and let's move our first macro. So in this case, our macro fills the full value of the unison panning. Additive is adding the value of our macro to the destination value. Let's say our panning is manually at 50%, right? So let's bring this up to about 50, something like that. And let's see what happens now once we move our macro. So once our macro gets to 50% of its own value, the unison panning is now at 100% and the rest of the macro knob is useless. And that's because the unison panning is already at 50 and our macro is adding another 50 to that, making our unison panning at 100%. So there's nowhere left to go, right? Now, if we change this to percentage, the last 50% of the unison panning will cover the entire macro knob. The sliders are also very important that's controlling our depth. So for this example, let's go to a mod envelope. Let's drag and drop this to our cutoff, bring our cutoff down just a little bit here, and inside our mod matrix, here's our depth slider, and this can go right in positive territory, or we can go left into negative territory, which is going to have the opposite effect. To the right of that is going to be the shape, so we can click this here, and if we don't always want a linear modulation, then this is where we can go and adjust the curve by clicking and dragging something like this here. And we can also double click to add different points and change our curves however we would like. The next parameter is going to be the lag parameter. So for this example, we're going to go to an LFO, and then we can click this shape and change it to a square wave. Now let's drag and drop this onto our transpose. Now inside our mod matrix, we don't want this steppy version, so we can right click this here, go down to our first oscillator, into general, and then the transpose right above steppy. Now take a listen to see what happens once we add some depth here. Right, we're changing the pitch with this square wave. Now, for example, let's say we want to round this out a little bit or make it a little bit softer, not so sharp. This is where this lag is going to come into play. For a closer look, we can slow this down just a bit here. If we ever want to have a larger view of the modulation matrix, we can click on the big view button on the left-hand side of the matrix right over here. If we ever want to initialize our mod matrix, we can click on the button right below it, and it'll ask us if we would like to initialize. So we've been using LFOs quite a bit so far, so let's take a look and see how they function inside Avenger. Now we can have up to 5 independent LFO modules if we keep hitting this plus over here on the right-hand side. We have lots of different shapes as well as 3 slots for custom shapes. But let's first map the LFO to the cutoff like we did a little bit earlier. So let's drag and drop here, and let's give it a little bit of depth inside the modulation matrix. If we click over here on LFO, here is going to be all the options and controls that are available to us. The first thing that we should know is this rate knob here, the biggest knob, and this is where we change the speed or the rate of the LFO. And as we move the knob closer to the left-hand side, the LFO becomes slower, and as we move it to the right-hand side, it's going to become faster. Now this LFO can be synced in straight time, triplets, and dotted via these 3 buttons down here at the bottom. We can set the LFO to Hertz mode by deactivating the currently activated sync button. So for example, this blue one right here is going to be our currently activated one. We deselect that, and now it's going to be in Hertz mode, all the way down here to 0, all the way at the top here to 100. Now below these sync buttons, we have a cool option called Synced Mod Trigger. So let's go ahead and reactivate sync, and this is going to become active or clickable. So let's click this and turn this on, and basically what this does is this allows us to switch our LFO to different speeds, but also stay in time. So for example, if we had something kind of slower down here, so what happened is that the LFO didn't change its speed immediately, but changed once the cycle was complete, keeping the LFO in sync. Now this can be cool if we have lots of different parameters tied to an LFO that we constantly change the speed up, maybe like a macro or something like that, and this is always going to keep our patch in sync with our track. So definitely use this feature as it's pretty helpful. The menu right below that is how we tell the LFO when to restart its cycle. So by default, this is going to be on first MIDI note, meaning that the first MIDI note that we play, the LFO will be triggered and start its cycle. The next one down is going to be last MIDI note. Now here, the last MIDI note will restart the cycle. If we held down a note and the LFO starts cycling, then if we add another note, the LFO will restart. Next up, we have free. This is a free running LFO, meaning that nothing is triggering it to restart. It just keeps cycling. Anything that we modulate with it, it's just going to hop onto the LFO at whatever value it happens to be at that point in time. Next up, we have host. Now, this will restart the LFO when the host transport begins playback. Another interesting category is the oscillator restart. So here we can have individual oscillators restart the LFO depending on the oscillator that we choose, which is rather self-explanatory. Or we can have all oscillators per voice restart the LFO, meaning that every voice gets its own LFO. So let's take a quick look at that. So from an init patch, what we can do is switch out our saw wave to a sine wave, and let's grab the first LFO, drag and drop this to the transpose, go to our mod matrix, give a little bit of depth, something kind of like that, and let's right click here, go to oscillator 1, general, and switch it out to the transpose and not the steppy one. So now we have something like this. We're basically modulating our pitch with this LFO, and we can even slow this down by a little bit. So now down here, we're on first MIDI note by default. However, if we go to this osc per voice, now take a listen to see what happens as we start adding notes. So do you see here in this situation that every note that we add gets its own LFO? Whereas if we went down over here to first MIDI note, all of these notes are going to get the same LFO. The arpeggiators and the drum sequencer can restart the LFOs. We can even have specific drums restart the LFOs as well. And this can be useful if we want to do something like sidechaining. So here's a quick demonstration on how that would work. So from an init preset, what we can do is bring our voices from 4 to 7, increase our unison all the way, and give us a little bit of detune. So from here, we can go to our LFO section, and then where it says CLFO1, we can start drawing our custom LFO shapes. So with this node, we can bring this somewhere around the middle area right here, give this a little bit of a curve. And then back in our shape area, we need to tell this LFO to use the custom shape that we just made. So if we click this here and then select our custom shape, which shows up right here, now we can drag and drop this LFO modulation onto the level. Now we need to bring this level all the way down manually and then use the modulation to bring this up all the way to the top. So 100 here, or we can grab our flag and bring this up to 100. So now the shape is modulating the level. Now we only want this to happen one time once it receives a trigger. So in this case, we're going for a kick drum. So what we can do is let's select one shot so it only happens one time. And then down here on first MIDI note, let's go down to drums and then select bass drum. So it's not receiving a trigger anymore. So it's not doing the shape. So now we can go to our drums and then add a drum set. So for example, one of my favorites is under Factory 2, and it's going to be this hyper techno. So once we have a kick drum, as we can see here, we have the drum sequencer, and we have our kicks down here. And every time it receives a kick, it's going to apply this sidechain, something like this. And notice how it stopped right around here. Now we can always improve this patch. You give it a little bit of reverb, a little bit of delay, something kind of like that. And maybe even in the effects, we can right click this here and add chorus, which is one of my favorites, increase the mix a little bit. And now we have something like this. And we can always edit the curve as well if we go down to the CLFO1, and we can adjust our curve, our timing, and everything else that the LFO has to offer. Definitely a pretty cool trick. And another thing to be aware of using custom shapes is that we can also use them for vibrato mode down over here, or we can use them for FM modes down over here as well. So here in the LFO section, the icons of the shapes are all pretty self-explanatory once we click this. However, I do want to point out that here we have a random square, and then below that a random triangle, and then these three down here are going to be our custom shapes. Now, if we're ever unsure exactly what a waveform is called, we can select one and drag our mouse over the waveform, and in the bottom tooltip, it'll tell you exactly what it is. So in this case, this is going to be a ramp down. So from an init preset again, we're looking here at the LFO section a little bit more in detail. So down here on the bottom left, we see this phase knob. Now here we can determine where the starting position of our waveform is going to be. And then we have offset, which is very, very important because here we can turn this bipolar signal into a unipolar signal. So for example, we can bring down our cutoff, something like that. And let's drag and drop this LFO here and give it a little bit of depth. Here we can see that this LFO is modulating in positive territory to the right of the knob and also in negative territory to the left of the knob. Now, if you just want this to modulate in the positive territory, we can bring our offset all the way to the right, or the opposite, we can bring this all the way to the left, and it's only going to modulate in negative territory. So next up, we have the delay knob. Now this knob will set a certain amount of time to wait before the LFO starts its modulation. And then if we click the menu up here, we also have delay sync. Now delay sync also delays the LFO, but the difference is here is that it can delay it in sync with our host tempo. So for example, if we went to delay sync and we wanted to delay our LFO by 1 bar, we would select 1/1, having the knob at about noon. Otherwise, we would just go to delay, and this is going to be measured in real time. And next, we have the fade in knob. This is kind of similar to the delay knob and its features. However, the difference here is that it's going to fade in the LFO. It's not just going to wait and then start the LFO at its full maximum value. And the tiny button on the right, we can determine the fade in curve. Something important to keep in mind is that not all modulations can be dragged and dropped. There's lots of extra options available directly in the modulation matrix only, so make sure to really go through the list for some cool options, as you might miss a couple things. Especially look in the math category. There's a lot of cool stuff and a lot of cool modulation sources that you can go through here. Avenger comes with a very useful step sequencer that we can use as a modulation source. We can have a total of up to 8 individual step sequencers, so we can first turn it on over here in our routing panel where it says step sequencer 1. Let's click the on button here, and let's navigate to the step sequencer tab here, and let's play a note. So here we can see that the volume is being controlled by the step sequencer, and we can go in and edit these steps as well if we click and drag. On the bottom left-hand side, we can turn this on or off. We can adjust the speed right over here. The mode menu is actually very cool. So by default, this is going to be on mono. Now we can click this and go to stereo. Now this is going to split our step sequencer in half. The top side is going to correspond to the left speaker, and the bottom side is going to correspond to the right speaker. So what we can do is right click and remove some of the ones like this, and then right click and remove some of the ones like that, and hit some notes. Next up, we have the length. All the way to the left is going to be 2 steps. All the way to the right is going to be 32 steps. So we can double click to default. And then we have our volume mix down here at the bottom. All the way to the left, we're not going to hear any effect of this. All the way to the right is full effect. Next up, we have stereo width. Now this is going to work with the stereo mode, so we can reduce the stereo width that we have. And then we can contour this a little bit as well, so it's a little bit more smooth. We have gate length here. Now keep in mind that we can connect notes with these little sliders here, something like that, and then this gate is going to work on that big block right over there. And then we have decay as well. So next up, we have fade and delay. Now these parameters are going to be kind of similar to the ones that we saw in the LFO section, this delay and fade knob. However, the differences here is that these are both going to be in synced time and not absolute time. Next up, we have the start note and the end note, and these start and end options allow us to select a certain key range of when the step sequencer should be active or not be active. And then we have a shuffle knob, which is going to change the rhythmic groove. Here on the bottom right, we have something called release mode. So let's add a little bit of a release to our amp here. And by default, this is going to be on continuous. And continuous will keep running the step sequencer during the release phase. Next up, we have closed, and closed will stop the sequencer and release phase when notes are no longer being played. And then we have open, and open is similar to close in that it stops the step sequencer, but with open, it lets the release phase complete. So we don't always have to use the step sequencer via the routing panel. We can use it as a modulation source for different things. So what we can do is go to this step sequencer, drag and drop this to the cutoff, maybe bring this down a little bit and give it some depth, a little bit of unison, and then let's see what we have. Okay, so let's say that we like this modulation and we want to control this via another modulation source, like a macro, for example, right? So when the macro is all the way down, there's no modulation, and when the macro is all the way at 100%, there's full modulation, and everywhere in between. So what we need to do is click this plus here and go to our macro, macro 1, and since we have both of these here in our modulation matrix, we need to bring this first one down to 0, and then our macro 1 to 100%. And here's the link that we have to make. Under this select target, we need to go to the mod matrix slot and select group step sequencer 1 to filter cutoff. And now, once this is all the way to the bottom, we have no modulation. And all the way to the top, we have full modulation and everywhere in between. What's also really cool is that we can use the step sequencer to modulate send effects. So for example, let's turn on our send reverb and give us a good amount here. And let's take it out of the first effects. And over here, let's give it some unison and maybe a little bit of detune. Okay, so now in the send rack, we need to send this out, not master effects, but send this to FX1. So it's getting processed through this reverb, sending out and then going into the first effects. So now on this first effect, we can right click and then add a transcape, and we can see here that it's going to be on the step sequencer 1. So if we go to the step sequencer 1, maybe give us that rhythm that we were doing before, and now take a listen. Our signal is clean, but the reverb is getting modulated via the step sequencer. And we can always go through different presets to see what sounds cool. So under here, we can go to Rhythmic Simple and maybe take a listen to Classic Gate 1. Now think of all the creative possibilities you can do with this process by putting different effects on this FX1. So next up, we have the pitch tab over here in the center, and here's where we can do lots of different pitch modulation. Avenger allows us to have up to 8 different pitch modules, and if we take a look at the routing panel, we can already see that our oscillator is routed to pitch 1, which is this pitch 1 right over here. Now we can scroll with our mouse wheel, we can double click to add points, we can move these up and down, we can click and drag and change the curve, and we can also right click and reset the envelope. So the center is no change, and above the center are going to be positive values, and below center are going to be negative values. And if we bring this leftmost node up a little bit like that and play some notes, we have instant pitch modulation. Now this envelope functions similar to the other envelopes inside Avenger and shares some common controls like we've discussed earlier on in the course, such as the mode, the speed, and the different syncing options. The range knob sets the pitch modulation from 0 at the very bottom and then 24 at the very top. So with this left node all the way at the top, we can keep this shape but adjust the pitch modulation with the range control. So for example, we can go all the way down here to the bottom and have no modulation or increase it for more. The pitch envelope modulates pitch very smoothly. However, if we wanted to make it sound a little bit more steppy, we can do that with the steps control. So let's bring this node down all the way here to the bottom for a little bit more modulation depth, and let's increase the steps knob. And we can bring this node a little bit more to the left. And if we added some reverb and delay to that, sounds pretty cool, and we can add an ARP and then maybe change this to a square wave to really tie this in. Definitely a lot of fun to play with. And next to that, we have the flip knob. Now this knob can invert the envelope shape entirely or anywhere in between. And next to that, we have key track. Now, this knob doesn't have anything specifically to do with the envelope itself, but it sets the range of what can be pitched. So if we set this down to 0, something like this here, and we play some notes on our keyboard, none of those notes will change the pitch, only the envelope will change the pitch. And we can go down to a negative 100%, which is just the opposite of full 100%. So next up, we have the pitch bend area. Now our pitch bend wheel is located on the bottom left of Avenger, and if we turn this up, that's going to move up 2 semitones, and if we turn it down, that's going down 2 semitones. And here we can change the value, so all the way up is going to be plus 24, And then all the way down, we can do 24 as well. And then we also have something called pitch bend lag, which is rather interesting. So if we set this back to maybe 2 and then bring this one maybe down for 1 octave and give it a little bit of pitch bend lag, and then move our pitch bend wheel, we can see here that we have a little bit of lag and it doesn't move instantly as we move our wheel. Add a little bit more here. A little exaggerated, but hopefully you understand what that does. This section over here is where we're going to add portamento or glide in our patches. Now, this is where notes glide their pitches into each other, and we have a few different options. It's going to be off by default, and our first one is going to be this mono legato. Now, mono legato, only one note can be played at once and will only slide when we're holding down a note and then we add another note. So it's going to sound something like this. Now, if we play these notes individually, they won't glide. Now the next one is going to be this poly legato. Now this one's similar to mono legato, but we can play more than one note at a time. And if we do it individually again, they will also not slide. Now the last one is going to be poly portamento. Now this is similar to the poly legato, but notes are going to always slide regardless if we hold them down or not. Next up, we have this really cool feature called split. Now, this allows us to split our keyboard on a certain note that we choose, and one half will not slide while the other half will slide. And this only works in both poly modes, and it's very useful if we have low-end notes that we don't really want to slide, and then we have higher notes like a lead or something that we do want to slide. Next up, we have the time and curve knobs. Now, time is going to determine how long these slides take. So, for example, by default, we have something at 25.02. And if we increase this, and right now curve is at the bottom, which is giving us a linear bend right here. However, if we turn this up and take a listen now, so next up, we have the mod envelopes. Now, this tab is access to the right of the pitch tab, and Avenger allows us to have up to 8 different mod envelopes. We can just keep hitting this plus. Now, these modulation sources are extremely flexible because we can draw in our own custom shapes and adjust the curves in between all those points. Now, Avenger is very streamlined that by now you should be familiar with the controls at the bottom, as they're very similar to the other envelope editors that we previously covered, such as the mode, the speed, the sync, and the trigger. What's different here and also very useful is this offset control on the right-hand side. The mod envelopes are unipolar by default at 100%, but as we adjust this control, we can change it to bipolar. So for example, what we can do is drag and drop this first mod envelope on our cutoff and bring this down a little bit and increase the depth here in the modulation matrix. And bring up a little bit of resonance. So we can see that this is a unipolar signal. And it's going to be positive because right here we're at 100%. However, we can go all the way down to negative 100% and invert it. And if we ever want to have an even bipolar modulation source here, all we have to do is double click this here and set this to 0. Also, something very important to keep in mind, as it's very similar with a lot of different Avenger modules, is that we have a lot of presets at our disposal. So, for example, we can come up here where it says default, and we can go through all these different ones here and kind of see how they sound. So, for example, we can try this hand clap 10 on our cutoff. So if we ever needed a very specific modulation source and very customizable, the mod envelopes are going to be perfect for that job. If you haven't noticed by now, below the editor screen and above the keyboard, we have quick access modulation sources that we can drag and drop where we'd like. So for example, we can drag this random to our transpose and increase the depth here in the mod matrix, and then hit some notes and get random notes back. This is also very useful for putting things on the mod wheel or the pitch wheel or really anything here that we would like. Alright guys, this concludes the video on the modulation matrix, the step sequencer, the pitch and mod envelope tabs. I hope you now have a better understanding of how Avenger works and also how versatile it really is. Thank you so much for watching and have a great time using VPS Avenger 2.